The morning arrived as a slow spreading of grey light across the Douro valley, the sky a single unbroken shroud of cloud that held back the sun but not the warmth. The river below the lodge lay flat and unmoving, a sheet of old pewter that reflected nothing but the dim shape of the hills. In that half-light, the Rebelo boats rested against the quay with their long steering oars shipped and their empty barrels stacked in rows along the decks, the wood of each cask still damp from the night's humidity. The air itself had weight, a thickness that clung to the skin and promised a day of deep, slow heat, the kind of morning that erased all hurry and left only the quiet certainty of tasks to be done at a gentle pace. You stood in the wide doorway of the lodge, one shoulder resting against the stone frame, and let your gaze travel across the familiar scene. The building rose behind you, a long, low structure of thick granite that faced the river with high, small windows. Its double doors had been unbarred just a few minutes earlier, the iron latch still cool to the touch, and the scent of the old wood mixed with the dampness of the floor inside. From where you stood you could see the first suggestion of the terraced vineyards on the far slopes, blurred by a haze that softened every edge and turned the hills into layers of grey-green shadow. The boats nearest to you gave off a faint smell of old water and sun-dried timber, a scent threaded with the mineral tang of the river stones. Nothing moved except a single gull that wheeled once and then settled on a mooring post, folding its wings with the same slow deliberation that governed everything here. Inside the lodge, the darkness gathered like a held breath, the air tasting of oak and wine spirit and stone that had never truly dried. You turned from the doorway and stepped over the threshold, your boots making a soft, gritty sound on the packed earth and scattered straw. The cooper had been here the day before, leaving a neat arrangement of his tools on a low bench near the entrance, a curved draw-knife with a blade still bright from the last stroke, a mallet whose handle was worn smooth by 1,000 taps, a coil of willow bark waiting to be soaked and bound, and a half-finished bung of new oak still clamped in the shaving horse. The floor around the bench carried a scatter of fine wood curls that had fallen like pale ribbons and now lay undisturbed. You paused near the bench and let your eyes adjust, the shapes of the barrels emerging as you drew deeper into the space. They lay on their sides in long, orderly rows, their heads facing the central passage, each one marked with chalk numbers and initials that you could read by touch if needed. The high windows above admitted only narrow slits of daylight, and the dust drifted in those beams like fine flour, suspended and circling without urgency. The quiet held a particular quality, a stillness made up of many small absences. There was no wind to stir the roof tiles, no rigging creaking on the boats, no conversation from the quayside. The river's voice was too low to reach inside, and so the lodge offered a silence that felt older than the walls themselves. A silence you had learned to trust. In that absence of sound you could hear your own pulse if you stood very still, a soft background measure that reminded you of the body's own slow pace. The first thing to do each morning was to listen to this silence before the sun grew strong enough to wake the insects and draw the birds into full song, and you did so now, breathing in the cool thickness of the air and letting it settle deep into your lungs. The warmth from outside had already begun to press against the stone, a gentle, persistent hand that would not withdraw until late evening, but inside the lodge there was still a memory of night's coolness trapped in the floor and rising from the lower stones. You could feel the temperature difference on your face, the cool of the cellar meeting the warmer air of the threshold, and the sensation was like sinking slowly into a deeper, calmer layer of the world. You passed the cooper's bench and walked along the central aisle, the barrels on either side forming a corridor of curved shadows that reached almost to the vaulted ceiling. Your footsteps echoed only slightly, swallowed by the wooden walls and the packed earth. Some of the barrels held young port from the most recent harvest, their spirit still sharp and fruity, while others contained wine from seasons past that was growing quieter and deeper with each passing month. All of them needed topping up in this weather, because the summer heat drew the liquid up through the oak pores, sending a small portion into the air as the angels share. That would be your work today, a long and methodical circuit through the rows, but for now you were not yet ready to begin. The morning still demanded its moment of quiet recognition, its pause before any task. You came to a stop beside a barrel in the second row, one that had been filled the previous autumn and marked with the chalk letters of a quinta high on the upper slopes. Its bung was a tight plug of soft wood wrapped in a scrap of linen, and the iron hoops showed a faint bloom of rust where damp fingers had touched them months ago. You laid a hand on the swell of the stave, feeling the slight grain under your palm, the wood neither warm nor cold, but in a middle state that felt almost alive. The surface was dry, though you knew that inside the wine was breathing, moving through its slow chemistry, shedding its youth and gathering the darker, softer tones that would earn it the name of port. Through the thick oak, you could not hear anything, not a gurgle or a sigh, but you could sense the weight of the liquid, a fullness that pressed outward against the iron hoops with a patient, insistent force. Beyond the barrels, the back of the lodge opened into a smaller room where the tasting table stood, a scarred slab of chestnut with a bench on one side and a shelf of small glasses above it. You glanced in as you passed, noting the dust that had settled on the glasses and the dried stain of a long spilled drop that had darkened the wood in a feathery ring. No one would come to taste today. The days of trade and shipment were elsewhere, in the counting houses and the merchants' offices across the river. Here in the lodge the work was custodial, a slow tending that did not need an audience. You closed the inner door softly, its latch falling into place without a click, and returned to the main room. Your path took you past the racks of empty bottles waiting to be filled another year, their necks wrapped in straw, the long-handled brush for cleaning casks propped in a corner, the wooden ladder used to reach the barrels stacked 3 tiers high along the far wall. Everything rested in its place, patient and unchanged, coated with a fine layer of dust that seemed to soften every outline. The light at the doorway had brightened by a small degree, enough for you to notice that the haze over the hills was beginning to thin at the highest ridge. A faint golden thread showed where the sun would eventually break through, but it was still a long way off, and the valley remained in a state of suspended transition. The river stayed glassy, its surface holding the inverted shapes of the boats and the quay as if painted there with a single careful stroke. You stepped back to the entrance and drew in a lungful of the outside air, which had grown a shade warmer in the short time you had been inside, carrying now a hint of dried herbs from the slopes. The gull on the post shifted its weight from one leg to the other and tucked its beak deeper into its breast feathers, settling in for the long wait. Even the bird knew that nothing would happen quickly on such a morning, and its stillness felt like a small confirmation of your own slow rhythm. You turned your attention to the immediate need of the day, the topping up gear. It rested on a small wooden cart near the wall, a cask of fresh wine spirit that had been broached the evening before, a slender tapping pipe of polished wood, a small funnel of beaten copper, and a handful of clean linen plugs laid out in a neat row. The cask held perhaps 20 litres, enough for several rows if you were careful, and you noted the level by the shadow inside the bunghole, a dark circle that sat a few inches below the rim. The tapping pipe was cool and smooth, its spout shaped like a flattened beak to deliver a thin, controlled stream, and you lifted it from the cart to turn it over in your hands, checking for any crack or split. There was none. The wood was sound, seasoned by many seasons of use, and it fit your grip as naturally as a spoon. You set it back down and listened again, aware that the day's rhythm would soon begin, but not yet willing to disturb the calm. The silence held, and you let it hold you, feeling the slow beat of your own heart merge with the deeper stillness of the lodge. Now the distant murmur of the river became just audible, a sound that rose not from the water itself, but from the faint stirring of the current against the boat hulls, a soft lapping that seemed to breathe in time with your own rest. The hills on the far bank were clarifying by slow degrees, the haze thinning enough to reveal the individual rows of vines that climbed in terraces like steps cut by a patient hand. The vines themselves were in full leaf, a deep green that appeared almost black against the pale earth. In another month, the grapes would begin to swell in color, but for now they were small hard beads that promised nothing yet, and the heat would be the deciding force, the heat that was already declaring itself. Inside your shirt, the morning's coolness was giving way to a damp cling, the fabric sticking lightly between your shoulders, and you did not mind. The warmth was a familiar companion, an element of summer that you had known since childhood, as predictable as the fog in winter and the floods in spring. It would grow and grow until the stones themselves seemed to sweat, and then it would ease with the coming of evening. But that was many hours away. You looked once more at the boats, their names painted in faded letters on their prows, names of saints, of women, of distant ports, each one long familiar. They sat so low in the shallow water that their keels must have been touching the mud, and their empty barrels were arranged in pyramids, 2 and 2 and 1, their hoops of chestnut darkened by river wet. The boatmen would come later to fill them with wine and float them down to the warehouses, but not today, and perhaps not tomorrow. There was no sign of them, no smoke from the little shacks along the bank where they slept between journeys. The whole river bend was a world suspended in its own quiet, asking nothing of anyone. You let your gaze fall to the flagstones at your feet, noticing the small weeds that pushed up through the cracks, wiry and determined, and a line of ants crossing from one fissure to another, carrying minute cargoes with a diligence that seemed almost out of place in the general stillness. You watched them for a moment, and then your mind drifted back to the barrels waiting inside, the rows of silent casks that represented years of work and patience, and you did not count them. You simply knew them by their positions, their marks, their individual sounds when tapped with a knuckle, some ringing with a higher note, some with a dull thud, each note telling you how much air sat above the wine. The sky began to pale from grey to a softer pearl, the clouds thinning in uneven streaks that promised a day of hazy sunshine rather than clear blue. The first real hint of sun touched the highest window of the lodge, casting a pale rectangle of light onto the back wall, where a cobweb glittered with trapped dew, and the light moved so slowly that you could not see it shift, though if you looked away and looked back you would find it had travelled an inch. That was the pace of everything here, the pace you had learned to match over the years. Now the time for stillness was drawing to its natural close, and you felt it not as an interruption but as a gentle transition, the way a sleeper knows when the dream is ending and wakefulness is rising. The silence had been heard, the morning acknowledged. The work ahead would require your hands and your attention, but it would ask for nothing fast, nothing loud. You would move from barrel to barrel, lifting the tapping pipe, tilting the small cask, watching the ruby stream descend into the dark, and that would be the whole of the day. A day without a single surprise, as smooth and level as the river itself. You turned from the doorway and walked back into the shadows of the lodge, your footsteps receding into the quiet, and the barrels waited in their long rows while the tapping pipe rested on its cart, the heat outside continuing its slow, steady rise. Nothing more marked the moment. The morning passed on, patient and complete, and the lodge held its peace. The lodge accepted you with the same quiet you had left moments before, its stone walls closing around your shoulders as you moved past the threshold and let the outer light fall away. The double doors remained open, a rectangle of pale morning framing the river and the boats, but you did not look back. Your eyes were already adjusting to the interior, the world of shadows and oak that stretched ahead in orderly rows. It took a few seconds for the shapes to resolve, for the long barrels on their wooden cradles to separate from the general dimness and become distinct, each one an individual vessel with its own color of wood, its own pattern of iron hoops, its own faint chalk marks on the head. The air inside had a different taste, a coolness that touched the back of the throat with a faint dryness, carrying the ghost of alcohol and the deeper earthier scent of wood that had been wet and dried and wet again over many seasons. Your footsteps made no echo now, just a soft scuff on the packed earth that absorbed every vibration, and the sound seemed to travel only a short distance before the space swallowed it. You stepped fully inside and closed the left-hand door behind you, not enough to darken the lodge, but enough to cut the breeze that had begun to stir along the quay. The other door remained open, a tall rectangle of grey-gold light that fell diagonally across the first few feet of the floor, illuminating the edge of the cooper's bench and the scattered curls of wood shavings. The shavings were still pale, still carrying the fresh scent of newly worked oak, and they lay in loops and spirals that caught the light and held it. Beyond that narrow pool of illumination the floor fell into deeper shadow, and the barrels emerged in tiers 2 and 3 high along the side walls, their curved surfaces catching a soft gleam from the high windows that ran just under the eaves. Those windows were narrow, arched at the top, fitted with small panes of glass that had rippled and thickened with age. They admitted a dusty, filtered light that seemed to hang in the air like gauze. The dust itself was always present, drifting slowly in the still air, visible only where the sunbeams cut across the room, and it moved with such leisure that watching it felt like watching the minute hand of a distant clock. The lodge was not a single cavernous space, but a series of connected chambers, each one opening into the next through wide, low archways that had been cut into the internal walls. The first chamber, where you now stood, held the newest barrels, those filled within the last year or two, their oak still pale, and their iron hoops bright with only the faintest bloom of rust. They lay on their sides in long rows of 6 or 8, resting on cradles of chestnut that kept them from rolling and allowed a man to walk between the rows without stooping. The cradles were worn smooth on their upper edges, polished by the passage of countless hands and the occasional brush of a hip or a shoulder, and the floor between them was slightly sunken, the earth compressed by generations of boots into a shallow trough that guided the feet forward. You walked along the first row, trailing your fingers over the curved staves, feeling the slight variations in their surface, here a knot in the wood that had been plugged with a tiny peg, there a joint where 2 staves met so tightly that a fingernail could not find the seam. Further along a place where the grain ran in a swirling pattern like a thumbprint in soft clay. Each barrel had its own temperature, its own faint vibration, a sense of the liquid that sloshed invisibly inside when you paused and pressed your palm flat against the oak. Above the first row, stacked on a heavy timber frame, lay a second tier of barrels that were slightly older, their heads marked with chalk numbers that ran from 37 to 52. These you could not touch without the ladder, and so you passed beneath them, noticing the way their shadows fell in striped patterns on the floor, a ladder of dark and pale that shifted as the morning light shifted beyond the windows. The chalk marks were a simple system, a number for the quinta where the grapes had grown, a letter for the year of harvest, and sometimes a small symbol that indicated the cooper who had built the barrel. You had learned these signs long ago, and they had become as familiar as handwriting. You could read a barrel's history at a glance, knowing that the one marked with a looping G and the number 14 contained wine from a small hillside vineyard whose grapes always ripened a week earlier than the others, or that the barrel with the crossed lines and the number 71 held a blend that the merchant had ordered for a particular ship that sailed the year before last. This knowledge was not held in the front of your mind, but deeper, in the place where the map of the lodge was inscribed, and you did not need to think about it as you moved. The second chamber through the archway was darker and cooler, its windows set higher and its walls thicker where the ground rose behind the building. Here the barrels were older, some of them having rested in their cradles for 5 or 6 years, and their wood had darkened to a deep russet brown, the color of dried chestnuts. Their hoops showed more rust, a fine powdery orange that came off on the fingers like chalk, and some of the older barrels had a bloom on their surface, a soft grey patina that was not mould, but a harmless layer of settled dust and dried spirit that had seeped through the wood and evaporated. The air in this chamber tasted rounder, less sharp than in the first room, with a sweetness that reminded you of dried figs and old leather. You paused under the archway and let your lungs fill with it, the scent coating the back of your tongue and lingering there. This was the heart of the lodge, the place where the wine learned patience, and it demanded a corresponding patience from anyone who entered. You slowed your pace, allowing your steps to become shorter and softer, and you noticed that even the dust in here was finer, hanging in the air like a mist rather than drifting in visible motes. The barrels in this second chamber were arranged not in long rows, but in blocks of 4, their heads facing inward, so that a man could stand in the center and turn slowly to inspect each one. The chalk marks on these were faded, some of them barely legible, but you could still make out the essential information. A date, a vineyard, a cooper's stamp. One barrel near the center of the block attracted your attention because its bung had been replaced recently, the new wood lighter than the surrounding staves, and you remembered that you had done that yourself on a wet afternoon in the spring, pulling the old swollen plug and fitting a fresh one with a few taps of the mallet. The barrel had a small leak, nothing serious, just a seepage that had left a dark stain down one stave like a tear track, and the new bung had stopped it. You touched the spot now, finding it dry, and the wood felt firm under your thumb. Satisfied, you turned and moved through the archway into the third chamber, the farthest from the entrance, where the oldest barrels rested in a darkness that was almost complete. This last chamber was not a room in the ordinary sense, but more of a recess, A deep alcove cut into the hill itself, with only a single high window the size of a baking tray set into the back wall. The window admitted a sliver of light that fell directly onto the floor, a sharp-edged rectangle of pale gold that touched nothing else. The barrels were stacked 3 high along the side walls, their heads facing out, and some of them had been here so long that the cradles had sunk slightly into the earth, tilting the barrels at a shallow angle. The wood of these oldest casks was almost black, a deep charcoal color that absorbed whatever light there was, and the iron hoops had rusted to a dark brown crust that flaked if touched. There were no chalk marks visible on these barrels. The markings had long since been absorbed by the darkening wood, or perhaps they had never been written, held instead in the memory of the lodge keeper who had tended them before you. You knew which ones they were by their position, and you had your own mark on them, a small notch on the bottom chime that you could feel with your thumb in the dark. You did not go among them now. You stood at the entrance to the alcove, breathing in the scent that was different again, a smell of deep earth and old wine and time itself, a smell that seemed to have no components but was simply a presence, like the smell of a very old stone church. From this farthest point you could look back through the 3 chambers in a single line of sight, the archways framing each other like a series of doorways in a dream. The light was brightest in the first chamber, a pale wash of grey and gold, and it dimmed progressively through the second chamber until it reached the deep shadow where you stood. This progression of light told the story of the wine, from the young and restless spirit near the door to the ancient tranquil liquid sleeping against the hill. You had warped this line thousands of times, and it never changed. Yet each time you noticed something small that you had not seen before, a spider web strung between 2 hoops, a fallen leaf that had blown in during the autumn and lay now as a dry skeleton on the floor, a small crack in one of the cradles that would need attention before winter. These details were not distractions. They were the texture of the place, the quiet evidence that the lodge was alive in its own slow way. Returning through the second chamber, you stopped at the spot where the tasting table stood, a plain slab of chestnut oiled by years of contact with hands and glasses. The shelf above it held a row of small glasses, their rims turned downward to keep out the dust, and beside them lay a tallow candle in a tin holder and a striker. You did not light the candle, but you noted its presence, knowing that on darker days or in winter when the sun set early you would need it. Beneath the table was a shallow drawer containing a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with notes in fading ink, dates of topping up, observations on the barrel's condition, the names of ships that had carried away previous batches. You had added your own lines to that ledger over the years, each entry a few words, nothing more than a record that on a certain day you had done what needed to be done. The ledger did not ask to be read, and you did not open the drawer. Now you turned your attention to the tools of the day's work. The cart with the topping up cask and the tapping pipe stood where you had left it, near the cooper's bench in the first chamber. You approached it and checked the small cask once more, noting that the spirit level had not changed overnight, the dark circle inside the bunghole still sitting where you remembered. The tapping pipe lay beside it, a piece of polished boxwood about the length of your forearm, its narrow end fitted with a small spout that had been carved to direct the liquid in a fine controlled stream. You picked it up and ran your thumb along its length, feeling the minute ridges where the wood grain had risen slightly from years of wetting and drying. It was a good tool, balanced and true, and you set it back down with care. Further along the cart lay a small mallet for tapping bungs securely into place, a roll of clean linen cloth, and a wooden bucket half filled with water for rinsing the pipe between uses. Everything was ready, but the morning still held its pause, and you did not hurry. Instead, you stood in the center of the first chamber, letting the space settle around you, aware of the coolness on your skin and the gentle pressure of the air against your ears. The lodge was not silent. There was a soft, continuous sound that you had not noticed when you first entered, a very low, rhythmic tick-tick that came from somewhere near the back wall. You traced it to a small leak in the joint of an overhead barrel, a single drop of wine that fell every few seconds into a wooden bowl placed there for that purpose. The wine was deep red, almost black, and it splashed into the bowl with a sound like a fingernail tapping on a tabletop, barely audible unless you listened for it. You made a mental note to investigate the leak later, but it was not urgent. The bowl would hold many more hours' worth of drops. The sound was not a disturbance. It was a part of the lodge's natural rhythm, like the ticking of a clock or the creak of a settling timber, and it merged gently into the stillness. The light from the doorway brightened slightly, the grey clouds thinning enough to allow the first direct sun to touch the flagstones outside, and a warm reflection bounced inside, illuminating the left-hand wall where a row of empty bottles were racked in a diamond pattern. The glass caught the light and threw tiny, wavering reflections onto the ceiling, a faint dance of fragmented sun that moved only when you moved your head. It would be hot outside now, the stones warming quickly, but inside the lodge the temperature would stay level for several more hours. The thick walls, the packed earth floor, the high roof of terracotta tiles insulated by a layer of straw, all worked together to keep the summer at bay, and you were grateful for that without forming the thought in words. It was simply a bodily comfort, a release from the oppression of the sun. You moved to the first barrel in the nearest row, the one that had drawn your attention earlier with its fresh chalk marks and its tight linen-wrapped bung. You placed your hand on the swell of the stave and let it rest there, feeling the wood's temperature, which was slightly cooler than your palm. The iron hoops were dry but not rusted, and the wood showed a faint pattern of medullary rays, tiny silver lines that ran across the grain like the marks of a fine brush. This barrel held wine from the previous autumn, a young port that was still working its way through the first slow fermentation, and it needed topping up more often than the older barrels because the young wine evaporated faster in the heat. You estimated by the feel of the stave that the ullage was perhaps 2 fingers deep, maybe 3, and you knew that the first task of the day would be to bring this barrel and its neighbors back to the fill line. The tapping pipe waited on the cart, the spirit cask was ready, and the day stretched ahead with nothing to interrupt it but the slow movement of the sun across the high windows. You lifted your hand from the barrel and let it fall to your side, and the lodge continued to breathe around you, patient and still, while the distant river made its soundless journey past the quay and the boats that slept there. The cart stood exactly where you had left it the evening before, its wooden wheels wedged with 2 small stones to prevent any creeping movement on the gentle slope of the packed earth floor. Its surface was a single plank of chestnut, darkened at the edges where years of spilled spirit had soaked in and dried, leaving a faint stickiness that caught the dust and held it in a fine grey film. The small cask of fresh wine spirit rested in a shallow cradle on the cart, held in place by 2 curved blocks that cupped its lower third, and beside it lay the slender tapping pipe, the wooden plug, the copper funnel, and the roll of clean linen rags. Each item in its accustomed position. You had arranged them the previous afternoon after finishing the last row, knowing that the morning would begin with the same task in the same place, and the familiarity of the arrangement was a quiet comfort, a small order in a world that asked for nothing more. The spirit cask was not large. It reached halfway to your knee when you stood beside it, and its staves were pale, almost white, the wood of a younger cooper, whose work you recognized by the tightness of the joints and the delicate bevel on the chime. A soft wood bung wrapped in a scrap of muslin sealed its top, and you loosened this now with a gentle twist, feeling the slight suction give way as the cloth released its grip on the rim. The scent that rose from the open bunghole was sharp and clean, a clear alcohol smell with a fruity undertone that spoke of young grapes in the copper stills where the spirit had been drawn off. It was not a smell to linger over, it was a working scent, brisk and purposeful, and it cut through the heavier aroma of the aging barrels like a thin blade. You lifted the tapping pipe from the cart and let it rest across your open palms, a length of polished boxwood that had been turned on a lathe long ago by a craftsman whose name was now forgotten. The pipe was slightly thicker at one end, where a small cup had been hollowed out to receive the spirit from the cask, and it tapered evenly to a flattened spout at the other end, the spout shaped like a duck's bill to deliver a narrow, controlled stream. The wood was cool and smooth, almost slippery under your thumbs, and the grain showed as a series of very fine, parallel lines that ran the full length of the piece, interrupted only by a small knot near the middle that looked like a dark eye. You had held this pipe 1,000 times, and you knew its weight exactly, the way it balanced between your hands, the way the spout had darkened over the years from the wine that had passed through it, a stain that no amount of rinsing could remove. The inside of the pipe was hollow, of course, a narrow channel that ran from the cup to the spout, and you had cleaned it the night before with a slender brush and hot water, then left it to dry on the cot. It was bone dry now, and when you raised it to your lips and blew gently through it, the air passed with a faint, reedy whistle that was barely louder than your own breath. With the pipe in one hand, you turned to the first barrel in the nearest row, the young one with the fresh chalk marks and the tight bung of new oak wrapped in linen. The barrel rested in its chestnut cradle at waist height, its curved belly facing upward, and the bung hole was a dark circle about the width of 2 fingers, positioned near the top of the head where the staves met the chime. A soft plug of folded cloth stoppered the hole, not the bung itself, for in the warmer months you often used a cloth plug to allow the wine to breathe a little while, still keeping out dust and insects. The final bung of oak would be tapped in later, when the topping up was complete and the wine needed a longer seal. You reached down and hooked a finger into the fold of the cloth, pulling it free with a soft, sucking pop that released a puff of air carrying a richer, deeper scent than the spirit cask, a smell of young wine still working, of dark berries and something floral, like crushed violets, and underneath it, the faint, pleasant mustiness of the oak itself. The plug was slightly damp, stained a deep purple at its tip, and you laid it on the cart beside the linen rags, noting that it would need to be rinsed before being used again. The open bung hole now showed a small circle of darkness, and when you leaned close you could see the surface of the wine a few inches below, a glossy, almost black disc that reflected the high window as a tiny blurred rectangle of pale gold. You positioned the cart so that the spirit cask stood to the left of the barrel, within easy reach, and you steadied the tapping pipe in your right hand while your left hand rested on the rim of the cask. The morning light had shifted just enough to fall more directly through the doorway, and a warm shaft of sun now touched the side of the barrel, illuminating the iron hoops and the grain of the oak with a clarity that made every detail stand out. You could see the tiny pores in the wood, the faint scratches left by the cooper's plane, the darker patch where a knot had been drilled out and plugged, and you could see the curve of the wine's surface inside, a trembling meniscus that responded to the slightest vibration. The act of topping up was simple, and you did not need to think about it any more than a baker needs to think about kneading dough. You tilted the spirit cask forward with your left hand, careful not to tip it too far, and you inserted the cup end of the tapping pipe into the cask's open bung hole, holding it steady while the spirit flowed into the hollow channel. The liquid made a brief gurgling sound as it filled the pipe, a sound that was swallowed almost immediately by the surrounding stillness, and then it emerged from the spout in a thin, continuous stream that glittered in the shaft of sunlight. You guided the spout to the open bung hole of the barrel and let the spirit fall inside, a slender column of ruby bronze that caught the light and turned it into something jewel-like, a liquid thread that seemed to spin out of the air and disappear into the darkness below. The sound it made was soft and rhythmic, a gentle trickle that varied only slightly as the flow steadied, and you watched the surface of the wine inside the barrel begin to rise. It was a slow process, because the stream was thin by design. A heavier pour would disturb the sediment and cloud the wine, and so you had learned to let it take its time, to match the pace of the lodge itself. You held the pipe steady with both hands now, the left supporting the cup end while the right guided the spout, and your eyes remained fixed on the dark circle of the bung hole, watching the wine level creep upward. At first the rise was almost imperceptible, a gradual change that you felt more than saw, but as the seconds passed and the spirit continued to flow, the glossy surface inside the barrel began to reflect more light, and you could see the gap between the wine and the rim of the bunghole shrinking. The mark you looked for was a small scratch on the inner edge of the stave, a line you had cut with the point of a knife the previous week when you had last topped up this barrel. It was not a deep mark, just a shallow groove that caught the light at the right angle, and it indicated the fill level that you had determined was correct for this stage of the wine's aging, high enough to minimize the airspace, low enough to allow a small amount of breathing. As the wine rose toward this line, you slowed the pour, tilting the cask back slightly to reduce the flow, and the stream narrowed to a trickle, each drop falling with a tiny, distinct plink into the barrel. The surface trembled with each impact, concentric rings expanding and fading, and the reflection of the window wobbled and danced. When the wine finally kissed the scratch mark, a fraction of an inch below the rim of the bunghole. You stopped the pour entirely by lifting the spout clear of the hole. A single drop hung from the tip, catching the light for an instant before it fell, and you caught it on a corner of the linen rag that you had taken from the cart. The spirit that had splashed onto your fingers was cool and faintly sticky, and you wiped your hand on the same rag before setting it aside. The first barrel was topped. You leaned forward to look more closely at the fill line, verifying that the wine sat exactly where you wanted it, and then you reached for a fresh linen plug from the roll on the cart. This one was clean and dry, a folded square of unbleached cloth that had been washed in the river the week before and dried in the sun until it was stiff and sweet-smelling. You fitted it into the bunghole with a gentle press of your thumb, making sure it sat firmly, but not too tightly. It needed to allow a small amount of air to pass, to let the wine breathe, and so you did not ram it home, but left it just snug, its top edge flush with the rim of the hole. The barrel was now sealed against dust and insects, and it would continue its slow, invisible work until the next topping up, whenever the heat demanded it. You straightened and let your shoulders drop, feeling a slight ache from the position you'd held, and you rolled your neck once, a small automatic movement that brought your attention back to the wider room. The act of topping up the first barrel had taken longer than it might have because you had been deliberate, but there was no urgency and no need to count the minutes. The sun had advanced a little further across the floor, the shaft of light from the doorway now touching the second barrel in the row, and the dust that floated in the beam had rearranged itself into new patterns, swirling gently as the air shifted with your movement. You set down the tapping pipe on the cart, wiped its spout with a corner of the rag, and poured a small amount of water from the bucket over the cup end, rinsing away the spirit that clung to the wood. The water made a soft, splashing sound as it fell into the bucket, and you watched it drip for a moment before replacing the pipe in its accustomed spot. The cask of spirit was still more than 3/4 full, enough for many more barrels, and you tapped the bunghole lightly with the heel of your hand to seat the softwood bung back in place, though you knew you would need to open it again soon. Now you stepped back from the cart and let your gaze travel along the row of barrels that stretched ahead, each one waiting for the same attention. There were perhaps 30 barrels in this first chamber alone, and each would need its level checked, its cloth plug removed, its spirit topped to the mark. The work would occupy the morning and perhaps part of the afternoon, but you did not think of it in terms of time. You thought of it as a journey through the rows, a slow progression from one vessel to the next, each step a small, complete action that required nothing more than your presence. The tapping pipe and the cask were ready, the light was steady, and the lodge held its quiet, uninterrupted rhythm. You moved to the second barrel, a slightly older cask with hoops that showed the first signs of rust, and you rested your hand on its stave, feeling the familiar temperature of the wood. Through the open bunghole you could see the wine level a little lower than it had been, maybe 1.5 inches below the mark, and you pulled the cloth plug with a soft sound, laying it on the cart beside the first one. The scent from this barrel was different, a touch earthier, with a hint of blackcurrant, and you paused for a moment to breathe it in before reaching again for the tapping pipe. The pipe felt cool in your hands once more, and you inserted the cup end into the spirit cask, tilting it to start the flow. The thin stream of ruby liquid fell into the second barrel with the same soft trickle, and you watched the level rise with the same patient attention. There was a mark inside this barrel too, a small nick in the oak, and when the wine reached it you stopped and sealed the bunghole with a fresh plug. The action repeated itself, and you found a deep contentment in the repetition, a sense that the world was exactly as it should be, that the wine was safe, and the heat was outside, and you were here, inside, doing the work that you had always done. The morning continued to pass in this way, barrel by barrel, with no sound but the soft pour of spirit and the distant, steady tick of the leaking drop falling into its bowl somewhere deeper in the lodge. The air in the lodge was never truly still, though it gave that impression to a casual glance. It moved in currents too small to stir a dust mote, too gentle to be felt on the cheek, but it moved nonetheless, rising from the warmer stones near the outer wall and sinking along the cooler floor in the deeper chambers. This movement was the great, slow breath of the building, and it carried with it the invisible work of the summer heat. Every barrel in the rows was losing something to that breath, a tiny portion of its contents rising through the pores of the oak and mingling with the cellar air. The old vintners had a name for this loss, calling it the angel's share, and the name was apt because the portion was never wasted. It simply rose into the dimness above the casks and became part of the lodge's scent, part of its character, a ghost of wine that clung to the rafters and the tiles. You had known about the angel's share since your first day in the lodges, taught by an older keeper who had since retired to a small quinta up Raya, and you had long since accepted it as a fact of the work, something to be measured and compensated for, but never mourned. The wine gave a little of itself to the air each day, and each day you returned that gift in the form of fresh spirit, maintaining a balance that had held for centuries. The process of evaporation was not a simple one, and you understood it not through books, but through years of observation. The wood of the barrels was porous, a tight lattice of fibers that had once carried water up from the roots of a great oak tree. Those tiny channels were still open, though crushed and bent by the Krupa's shaping, and they allowed the most volatile elements of the wine, the water, and the lighter alcohols to escape molecule by molecule. In the cool months, this loss was so slow as to be almost negligible, a matter of a few drops per barrel per week. But in the heat of summer, the rate increased fourfold or more, and a barrel could lose as much as a litre in a single month. The warmth outside, pressing against the stone walls and radiating down through the roof tiles, raised the temperature inside the lodge by a few crucial degrees, and those degrees were enough to accelerate the quiet exodus. The angels were thirstier in summer, the old keeper had said, and you often thought of his words when you saw the fill levels dropping day by day. This morning, as you moved from the first barrel to the second and then on to the third, you began to notice the evidence of that thirst more keenly. After you had topped the second barrel and sealed it with a fresh plug, you paused and looked more carefully at the row ahead, your eyes tracing the chalk marks in the dark circles of the bungholes. Some barrels had lost more than others, and this variation was one of the things that kept the work interesting, if that was the right word for something so quiet. The barrels nearest the outer wall, where the morning sun fell first, always showed a slightly greater ullage than those in the middle of the row, where the shadows lingered longer. The older barrels, with their thicker, denser wood that had been saturated by years of wine, evaporated more slowly than the younger casks, whose staves were still relatively dry and absorbent. The size of the barrel mattered too. A larger pipe with its greater surface area would lose proportionally more than a smaller quarter cask. You had learned to read these differences at a glance, and you let your eyes do the reading now, estimating the ullage in each barrel before you even approached it. The air itself seemed to confirm your observations. As you straightened from the second barrel and wiped the tapping pipe with the rag, you became aware of a faint, almost imperceptible moisture in the atmosphere, a humidity that had not been present earlier. This was the angel's share made tangible, the escaped spirit hanging in the air and giving it a slight weight, a very slight stickiness that caught in the back of the throat. It was not unpleasant. It was the smell of the lodge's health, proof that the wine was alive and breathing. You could also feel it on your skin, a thin film that formed on your forearms and forehead as you worked. Not quite sweat, but a combination of your own perspiration and the ambient moisture from the barrels. The limestone walls, normally dry to the touch, had developed a faint coolness that was almost damp, as if they too were exhaling something held since the night. It was a sign that the day was already hotter than the day before, that the sun was working harder on the tile roof and the outer stones, and that you would need to adjust your topping routine accordingly. The third barrel in the row was a young one, filled only the previous November, and its wood was still the pale gold of freshly planed oak. When you pulled the cloth plug and peered inside, you saw that the wine level had fallen a full 2 inches since your last visit, a loss that was notably greater than the others in the row. This did not alarm you. It was expected. Young wood was thirsty, and the wine inside was still lively, full of the heat of its first fermentation, eager to give up its volatile fractions to the air. You also noticed that the inside of the bunghole was wet, beaded with tiny droplets of condensation that caught the light from the doorway and glittered like a cluster of pinheads. This was the wine's own breath, condensing on the cooler rim of the hole, a miniature cycle of evaporation and condensation that mirrored the larger cycle of the valley, where the river mist rose at dawn and fell again as dew on the vines. You wiped the rim with a corner of the rag, clearing the droplets so that they would not interfere with the new fill line, and you reached for the tapping pipe with the same calm automatic motion you had used twice before. As the thin stream of spirit fell into the third barrel, You watched the surface rise and thought about the journey the escaping vapor took. It left the wine as invisible particles, drifting upward through the narrow neck of the bunghole or seeping directly through the staves themselves. Passing between the fibers of the oak, once free, it mingled with the air of the lodge, swirling in the slow currents, rising toward the high ceiling where the roof timbers absorbed a portion of it into their ancient dry pine. Some of the vapor would find its way to the small high windows and slip through the gaps in the glass, escaping into the outside air where it would be carried away on the breeze that blew along the Douro. Other portions would settle on the stone walls, forming a microscopic film that gradually built up into the dark, glossy patina that coated the lower stones like lacquer. Still more would be breathed in by you, the keeper, as you worked, entering your lungs and becoming part of your own body for a brief time before you exhaled it back into the room. The angel share was a gift that touched everything, a continuous offering that connected the wine, the lodge, and the outside world in a single, seamless process. You finished topping the third barrel and sealed it, then moved to the fourth, which was an older cask with dark, weathered staves marked by the initials of a quinta you had visited once as a young man. Its ullage was less than that of the third barrel, only a finger's depth, and the wine inside smelled different when you removed the plug, deeper, rounder, with notes of dried cherry and a faint smokiness. The older wine gave up its angel's share, more reluctantly, having already shed most of its volatile youth, and what remained was a denser, more concentrated liquid that clung to the oak rather than trying to escape through it. You topped it with a smaller amount of spirit, barely a cupful, and you were careful to add it slowly so that the new spirit would have time to integrate with the older wine rather than sitting on top as a separate layer. This was a detail that some keepers overlooked, but you had learned that a gentle pour, a slow stream that barely disturbed the surface, allowed the spirit to blend more naturally, and the wine would be better for it in the long years of its aging. The work continued along the row, each barrel presenting its own small variation on the same theme. Some plugs were tight and difficult to remove, the cloth having swollen with absorbed moisture and sealed itself into the bunghole like a cork. These you pried out carefully, using the tip of the tapping pipe as a lever, and you set them aside to dry before they could be reused. Other plugs were loose and came away with the slightest tug, a sign that the air pressure inside the barrel had dropped as the wine cooled overnight, creating a small vacuum that held the plug less firmly. The ullage varied barrel by barrel, and you adjusted the amount of spirit you added each time. One barrel needed nearly a full quart, its level having dropped alarmingly since your last visit, and you made a mental note to check its staves more carefully later, for such a rapid loss might indicate a small crack or a leaky bung. Another barrel needed only a few spoonfuls, its level having barely changed, and you gave it a quick top and moved on. The light from the doorway continued to advance across the floor, the sunbeam now touching the sixth barrel in the row, and the dust in its path swirled more actively as the air warmed and began to stir. Your body settled into the rhythm of the work, the small repeated movements becoming automatic enough that your mind could drift slightly while still attending to the task. You thought about the oak trees that had given their wood for these barrels, great sessile oaks from the forests of northern Portugal and Galicia, their trunks split with wedges and shaped by skilled coopers who had learned their trade from their fathers. The wood of each barrel was subtly different depending on where the tree had grown and how it had been cut. Some staves showed a tight, even grain that the cooper had selected for its resistance to leakage. Others had a wider, more open grain that allowed a greater rate of evaporation, and these barrels were often used for younger wines that needed to breathe more. The cooper had understood the angel's share better than anyone, for he had built the barrels to lose a precise, predictable amount, not too little and not too much, a loss that would concentrate the wine and soften its character over the years. The angels were not thieves. They were helpers, and the barrels were designed to let them do their work. After the eighth barrel, you paused and set down the tapping pipe, rolling your shoulders to release the tension that had built between your shoulder blades. The warmth inside the lodge had increased noticeably, the cool of the morning now entirely gone, replaced by a dry, steady heat that pressed gently against your skin. The air in the first chamber was now only a few degrees below the outside temperature, and the second and third chambers deeper in the hill would be slightly cooler, but still warmer than they had been at dawn. You walked to the doorway and looked out. the brightness making you squint after the dimness of the lodge. The river was a sheet of hammered silver, the haze now completely burned away, and the Rebelo boats cast sharp shadows on the quay. The boatman had still not appeared, and the only movement was a small flock of birds circling high over the far hills, their wings catching the light as they turned. The heat shimmered visibly above the flagstones, and you drew a deep breath of the hot air before turning back inside, where the work waited. Back at the cart, you checked the spirit cask and found that you had used perhaps a sixth of its contents. The rest would be enough for the remaining barrels in the row, and perhaps part of the next row, and you knew that you would need to refill the cask from the larger butts in the back chamber before the afternoon was over. You rinsed the tapping pipe again, watching the water drip from the spout, and you re-wetted the linen rag so that it would be cool against your fingers for the next set of barrels. The small bucket of rinse water had grown cloudy with traces of spirit and wine, and you made a note to change it at midday when the sun was highest and the heat at its peak. Nothing was urgent, but everything required attention in its own time, and the rhythm of the day was built around these small, necessary pauses. As you resumed your place before the 9th barrel, you found yourself thinking about the angels themselves, not as religious figures, but as a kind of poetry that the old keepers had used to make sense of the loss. The idea that something went upward, that the wine rose toward the light, was a comforting one, and it gave the work a dimension beyond mere maintenance. You were not just topping up barrels. You were participating in a cycle that had been going on since the first wine was sealed in the first wooden cask, thousands of years before. The angel's share was a reminder that nothing was truly permanent, that even the most carefully stored wine was slowly, gently returning to the air from which it had come, and that your role was simply to tend the process, to keep the balance, to ensure that what remained in the barrel was as good as it could be. This thought did not take the form of words in your mind, but rather a feeling, a quiet satisfaction that settled somewhere behind your ribs and stayed there as you worked. You pulled the plug from the 9th barrel and peered inside, noting that the ullage was about a finger and a half, the wine level clear and glossy. The scent from this one was particularly fine, a balance of fruit and oak and something older, something that hinted at the years of rest it would enjoy before being bottled and shipped. The angels had taken their portion from this barrel too, but they had left behind a wine that was already beginning to deepen and round, and you felt a small private pride in that, not because you had made the wine, but because you had helped to keep it safe. You reached for the tapping pipe, and the thin stream of spirit fell once more, a thread of gold in the dimness, while the lodge breathed around you and the warm air continued its slow, invisible work. The sun outside had climbed well past the morning's tentative reach, and now it ruled the valley with a steady, pressing authority that softened nothing and spared no surface. The grey clouds of dawn were a memory burned away so completely that even the memory of them had vanished, replaced by a sky of pale, hammered blue that seemed to vibrate with its own heat. On the flagstones of the quay, the light glanced off the worn granite in a way that made the stone appear to shimmer, a liquid dancing above the ground that was not water, but the visible breath of the earth itself. The Rebelo boats, which had lain in shadow only a few hours before, now cast knife-edged silhouettes on the dry planks of the jetty, and the empty barrels on their decks were baking in the direct glare, their hoops creaking faintly as the metal expanded. The far hills, which you had seen through the morning haze as soft layers of green and grey, had sharpened into hard outlines under the noonlight, every terrace and vine row standing out in detail but bleached of colour, a landscape of browns and dusty olives that offered no relief to the eye. The river down below had lost its morning flatness, and now sparkled with a million tiny points of reflected sun, each one shifting and winking as the slow current turned, so that the whole surface seemed to be in constant silent motion, like a field of hammered brass. On the roof of the lodge, the old terracotta tiles, laid in overlapping rows on a bed of straw and timber, began their daily conversation with the heat. They had been cool through the night, contracting in the darkness, and now each one stirred as the sun's warmth reached down through the outer layer of baked clay. The sound was not a crack or a snap, but a soft, intermittent click, a gentle ticking that spread across the roofline like the notes of a distant insect. One tile near the ridge would expand and shift against its neighbour with a dull wooden knock. A moment later, another tile lower down would answer with a sharper sound, a tiny chip of noise that travelled along the battens and faded into the straw. This clicking was so faint that you could only hear it when you stood still, and it was so irregular that it never became a rhythm, just a series of isolated, quiet reports that marked the progress of the sun across the tiles. The lodge seemed to be murmuring to itself in a language of clay and wood, a language that asked for no reply, and you had long since stopped noticing it consciously, though your ears registered it as part of the building's familiar presence. Inside the first chamber, the temperature had risen by perhaps 5 degrees since the early morning, and the air now carried a dry, sleepy warmth that seemed to press down on your shoulders and the top of your head. The thick stone walls had done their work and kept the worst of the outside heat at bay, but the long hours of sunshine were beginning to overcome that defense, the warmth seeping inward through the outer faces and radiating gently into the interior space. The difference was not uncomfortable, but it was noticeable, a heaviness that had replaced the earlier coolness, and it made the air feel thicker, as if each breath required a little more effort than before. The dust that drifted in the sunbeams from the high windows seemed to move more slowly now, the individual motes hanging in the light for longer intervals before they shifted, as if the heat had made even the dust lazy. The smell of the wine and the oak had intensified too, the volatile essences releasing more freely into the warmer air, and the scent was now so rich that you could taste it on your tongue. A faint sweetness of dried grape, the sharpness of young spirit, and the underlying earthy bass note of the old wood that had been wet and dry 1,000 times. Your shirt, a simple garment of unbleached linen that you had pulled on in the cool of dawn, now clung to your back with a damp persistence that you had learned to ignore many summers ago. The fabric had absorbed the moisture from your skin, the result not of heavy exertion, but simply of the body's steady, quiet work in the warm air, and it adhered to the hollow of your spine and the curve of your shoulder blades in a way that was familiar rather than irritating. The sleeves, which you had rolled to the elbow at the start of the day, had slipped down slightly and now rested in folds just above your forearms, and you pushed them back up with a single, automatic gesture of your thumb, without interrupting the rhythm of your hands. A small bead of sweat gathered at your temple, tracing a slow path down the side of your face before you wiped it away with the back of your wrist, leaving a faint cool trail that dried almost instantly in the air. The heat outside was not something you fought, it was a condition to be accepted, a rule of the season that you had obeyed since childhood, and you bent to it without resentment, allowing your movements to become softer and more deliberate as the morning advanced toward noon. In the middle of the first row you paused and set the tapping pipe on the cart, its polished length catching the light that now fell in a broad, golden shaft through the open doorway. The beam had travelled far across the floor, illuminating the edge of the cooper's bench and the rounded bellies of the 9th and 10th barrels, and it brought with it a visible thickness, a shimmering quality that revealed the heat as a physical presence in the air. You looked along the row and noted that the ullage in the remaining barrels would require at least another hour of careful work, but you did not hurry. The heat demanded a slower pace, and you followed its rule without complaint, letting your hands fall to your sides for a moment while you breathed in the scented air and let your gaze wander. The distant sounds from the river, which had been audible earlier as a faint lapping against the boat hulls, now came to you muffled and softened by the thick walls, reduced to a low, continuous murmur that was more a feeling than a sound, a gentle pressure on the eardrums that spoke of water moving past stone. The birds that had sung in the morning were silent now, resting in the shade of the olive trees on the slopes, and even the insects had quieted, waiting for the sun to pass its peak before resuming their drone. The whole world outside seemed to have drawn a long, slow breath and held it, suspended in the heavy air. You turned from the cart and walked to the doorway, stepping just over the threshold so that you stood in the narrow band of shadow cast by the lintel. The heat outside struck you immediately with a physical force, a dry, enveloping press that wrapped around your face and arms and made the air inside the lodge feel cool by comparison. The flagstones near your feet radiated warmth upward through the soles of your boots, and the light reflecting from the river was so bright that you had to narrow your eyes against the glare. The Rebelo boats still sat motionless, their shadows now shrunken to thin dark lines directly beneath them, and the empty barrels on their decks were bleached to a pale silvery grey where the sun struck them full on. No boatman had come, and none would come until the heat eased. They were wise enough to rest through the middle hours, sleeping in the shade of their huts or under the awnings stretched between the buildings. The quay was entirely empty, a stretch of white goldstone that led the eye to the hills and the terraces, and nothing moved anywhere in the visible world. The stillness was so complete that you could hear the faint, dry buzz of a single insect hovering somewhere near the roof tiles, a sound that seemed to come from very far away and yet was immediately present, a thin wire of noise that vibrated in the air without source. After a minute of standing in the doorway, you felt the heat begin to penetrate even your shaded position, and you stepped back inside, grateful for the lodge's thick walls that now seemed to wrap around you like a cool cloth. The transition was a small relief, not dramatic, but gentle, a lowering of the pressure on your skin that allowed your breathing to deepen. You returned to the cart and picked up the tapping pipe, its smooth surface warm now from the air rather than cool as it had been in the morning, and you resumed your position before the next barrel in the row. This one was an older cask, its staves darkened to a deep chestnut and its hoops showing a fuzzy orange bloom of rust that came off on your fingers when you touched them. The cloth plug was tight, swollen with the humidity of the barrel's interior, and you had to work it loose with a careful rocking motion that took more time than usual. When it finally came free, it released a puff of air that was noticeably warmer than the ambient temperature, a small exhalation from the wine that carried the scent of stewed plums and old leather. The ullage was deeper than you had expected, nearly 2 fingers, and you knew that the heat was accelerating the angel's share even in this older wood, drawing the spirit upward through the pores with a greater insistence than it had shown in the spring. You tilted the spirit cask and set the tapping pipe in place, guiding the thin stream of ruby liquid into the dark opening. The pour was slower today, not because the cask was heavy, but because your own movements had adopted the pace of the heat, and you let the spirit fall in a thinner ribbon than before, taking more time over each barrel so that the new liquid could settle gently onto the old without disturbance. The sound of the pour, a soft, steady trickle, merged with the other noises of the lodge, the distant tick of the leaking drop in its bowl, the occasional click of a roof tile overhead, and a faint, almost subaudible creak of the timber cradles as the barrels expanded slightly in the warmth. These sounds were not a discord, but a harmony, each one occupying its own layer of quiet, and together they formed the lodge's midday voice, a slow murmuring song that had no beginning or end. As you worked your way along the barrels, your body settled into a rhythm that was slower than the morning's pace but no less steady. Each action required a small effort that you noticed more than before: the lift of the tapping pipe, the tilt of the cask, the careful wiping of the spout with the linen rag. Your muscles moved without complaint, but they moved more deliberately, and you found yourself pausing after each barrel to rest your hands on the cart and let your gaze wander across the rows. The warmth had made you drowsy, in a way that was not unpleasant, a gentle weight on your eyelids and a softness at the edges of your thoughts, and you allowed yourself to drift slightly while still attending to the work. You thought of the river, how it would feel to step into its cool current, and then you let the thought go without grasping it. You thought of the vineyards on the far slopes, their grapes swelling invisibly in the sun, and you let that thought go too. The heat encouraged a kind of mental stillness, a quieting of the inner voice that matched the quiet of the lodge, and you accepted it as another aspect of the summer's rule. The ninth barrel was filled and sealed, then the 10th, and you moved the cart forward along the row, the small wheels bumping softly over the packed earth. The rinse water in the bucket was now warm to the touch, and you paused to change it, carrying the bucket to the doorway and pouring the cloudy liquid onto the flagstones outside, where it spread in a dark stain that dried almost immediately in the sun. You refilled the bucket from the large clay jar that stood in the corner near the cooper's bench, the water inside still cool from its overnight rest in the stone, and you took a moment to drink a ladleful yourself, feeling the coolness move down your throat and settle in your stomach. The water had a faint taste of clay and minerals, clean and simple, and it revived you just enough to continue. The afternoon was now beginning in earnest, though there was no clock in the lodge to mark its arrival. You knew it by the angle of the sunlight, which had shifted from the doorway and was now slanting through the high eastern windows in long, dusty columns that reached almost to the center of the floor. The beams had a deeper gold now, the color of hay or pale honey, and they fell on the far side of the barrels, painting the curved staves with warm stripes that alternated with cool shadow. The contrast made each barrel look like a work of careful carving, the grain of the wood standing out in sharp relief. In the second chamber, visible through the archway, the light was still dim and the air a fraction cooler, and you knew that you would move there when the first row was complete, following the shade as the sun continued its arc. For now you stayed where you were, your hands moving through the familiar sequence: pull the plug, check the level, tilt the cask, guide the stream, watch the rise, stop at the mark, seal with a fresh plug, wipe the pipe, shift the cart. The heat pressed gently on your temples and made the small bones of your wrists feel loose and warm, and you worked on in a state of calm, steady attention, noticing the tiny variations in each barrel's response to the weather. Some barrels, the ones nearest the outer wall, were warm to the touch on their sunward side, and these you topped with extra care, knowing that their contents were under the greatest stress. Others, shaded by the row above, were cooler and needed less. The wine inside would adjust, as it always did, to the slow cycle of the seasons, and your role was simply to help it through this hottest span of the year. The roof tiles clicked again, 3 in quick succession, and then fell silent. The river murmured beyond the walls, a sound so low that it was almost indistinguishable from the blood moving in your own ears. You wiped your forehead with your sleeve and continued along the row, the tapping pipe balanced in your hand, while the afternoon heat deepened around the lodge like water rising in a quiet pool. The first row of barrels was complete, each bunghole sealed with a fresh linen plug, each fill line resting exactly at its mark. You straightened from the final cask and let your arms fall to your sides, feeling the pleasant ache of sustained, gentle work spread across your shoulders and down into your forearms. The tapping pipe had grown warm in your grip, the boxwood absorbing the heat of your palm and the surrounding air, and you placed it carefully on the cart before rolling your wrists in slow circles to loosen the small joints. The cart stood at the end of the row now, its wheels having traced a shallow track in the packed earth, a track that would be smoothed away the next time you swept the floor, but which for now served as a quiet record of the morning's progress. The spirit cask was lighter, its contents diminished by perhaps a third, and the bucket of rinse water had taken on the color of weak tea, a mixture of water and spirit and the faintest trace of wine. You made a mental note to refresh it again before starting the second row, but the note was a gentle one, filed away in the part of your mind that kept track of small necessities without urgency. For now, you wanted a moment away from the cart, a brief change of perspective, and you turned toward the high window set into the eastern wall, the one that looked out over the river and the boats. The window was not like the doorway or the other openings. It was set high, its sill rising to the level of your chest, and it was narrow, a vertical slot in the thick stone that had been designed not for looking out, but for letting in a controlled amount of light and air. 4 iron bars, each as thick as your thumb, ran vertically from the stone lintel to the sill, set deep into the mortar and painted with a flaking coat of black that had worn away in patches to reveal the silvery metal beneath. The bars were cool to the touch, despite the heat, and when you laid your fingers on them, you felt the faint vibration that all iron carries, a kind of low, continuous hum that was really the memory of the forge where the bars had been shaped many decades ago. The glass above the bars was thick and rippled, full of tiny bubbles and imperfections that distorted the view, turning the outside world into a shifting, watery image. But you had learned to see through these distortions as if they were not there. You rested your elbows on the sill and leaned forward, your face close to the glass, and you let your gaze travel outward across the river and the quay. The Douro had changed its character entirely since the early morning, trading its slate-grey flatness for a surface of deep, polished copper that gleamed under the noon sun. The light fell on it, not as a single sheet, but as a million overlapping scales, each tiny ripple catching the brightness and throwing it back at a slightly different angle, so that the whole river seemed to be in motion even where the current was slow. Near the near bank, the water was a dark, opaque brown, the color of strong tea, reflecting the shadow of the quay wall, while further out it lightened to a bronze that shimmered and shifted as your eye moved across it. The far bank, where the terraced vineyards climbed step by step up the hill, was a tapestry of greens and browns bleached by the glare, the vines themselves invisible at this distance, but their rows marked by the parallel lines of stone walls that held the soil in place. Above the hills, the sky was a pale, almost white blue, the color of a thin blaze on porcelain, and there was not a single cloud anywhere in the arch of it, nothing to interrupt the steady flood of light. The Rebelo boats, which you had watched in the early morning from the doorway, now lay directly below the window, their broad beam and high prow visible in sharp detail. The boats were moored in a row along the quay, their hulls painted in dark colors of red and brown and black, the paint worn through in places to show the silvery grey of the underlying wood, and their long steering oars were shipped upright, rising from the stern like the tails of resting fish. On the deck of the nearest boat, a pile of empty port barrels had been stacked in a careful pyramid, their hoops of chestnut catching the light and their bungs facing inward to keep out the dust. The wood of the barrels was pale and dry, in contrast to the dark, saturated oak of the casks inside the lodge, and you could see the chalk marks on their heads, the same system of numbers and letters that you used yourself, indicating which quinta the wine had come from and which lodge it was destined for. The boats themselves seemed to be dozing, their hulls rising and falling almost imperceptibly with the slow breath of the river, and the mooring ropes that held them to the iron rings on the quay were slack, twisting slightly in the faint current. Beyond the boats, on a stretch of packed earth under the shade of a large plane tree, the boatmen had gathered. You could not see them clearly because the shadow was deep and dappled, the broad leaves of the plane tree cutting the sunlight into shifting patterns of gold and dark. But you could make out the shapes of their bodies, men sitting on the ground or on upturned barrels, their backs against the tree trunk, their broad-brimmed hats tilted forward over their faces. Some of them were lying on their sides, propped on one elbow, and the relaxed angles of their limbs spoke of a deep, comfortable rest. The kind of rest that only men who have worked hard in the early hours can fully inhabit. Their boats had been unloaded or loaded in the cool of dawn, the heavy barrels rolled up or down the gangplanks with the slow, coordinated effort of men who had done it 1,000 times. And now they were waiting out the heat in the only sensible way, sleeping or talking quietly, letting the hours pass until the sun eased and the river called them back to work. Their presence was a quiet confirmation of the rhythm you followed yourself, a shared understanding that the middle of a summer day was not a time for labor, but for patience. From the window, the voices of the boatmen reached you as a low, continuous murmur, a sound that had no distinct words and no clear source, but seemed to rise from the shade of the plane tree like the hum of a hive. The stone walls of the lodge filtered and softened the sound, stripping away the higher frequencies and leaving only a deep, melodic drone that blended with the whisper of the river and the distant, almost imagined rustle of the leaves. Occasionally, the murmur would lift into something brighter, a ripple of laughter that ran through the group and then subsided, leaving the deeper tone unchanged. You could not tell what had prompted the laughter, and it did not matter. It was simply the sound of men at ease, sharing a joke or a story or a memory, their words too far away to be distinct, even if the window had been open. The laughter rose and fell in a pattern that was as natural as the river's current, a brief brightening that came and went without disturbing the general calm. You found yourself listening without effort, the sounds settling into your awareness as another layer of the lodge's quiet music. The boatmen's voices reminded you of other summers, other days spent in the lodge when the heat had been just as deep and the river just as bright. There was a continuity to the sound, a sense that the same murmur had been rising from the same shade for generations, that the boatmen of 50 or 100 years before had laughed in the same way and rested under the same tree. The plane tree itself was ancient, its trunk thick and gnarled, its bark peeling in plates of grey and green, and it had shaded boatmen since the first port was shipped down the Douro. You did not think this in words. You felt it as a quiet presence, a thread that connected your own work to the work of all the keepers who had stood at this window before you, listening to the same sounds and feeling the same heat on their skin. The thought, if it could be called a thought, was a comforting one, and it settled somewhere deep in your chest, a warm, diffuse feeling that had no sharp edges. You let your gaze drift from the boatmen back to the individual boats, picking out the details that distinguished one from another. The nearest boat, its hull, a dark red that had faded to a dusty rose, had a name painted on its prow in letters that were now barely legible. Something ending in Osa, perhaps a woman's name or the name of a saint. The wood of the prow was carved with a simple pattern of waves, worn almost smooth by years of wind and water, and the iron ring at the bow was rusted to a deep orange that flaked when the boat moved against its mooring. The next boat along was smaller, its hull black with a red stripe at the waterline, and its deck carried not barrels but a cargo of folded sails and coiled ropes, the gear of a boat that was between journeys and would not sail again until the next shipment was ready. The third boat was empty, its deck scrubbed clean, and it rode higher in the water, its shadow falling in a crisp, sharp-edged shape on the riverbed, below where the water was shallow enough to reveal the round stones and the occasional flash of a fish. The river itself, which had held your attention for some minutes now, continued its steady, unhurried flow, the surface never the same from one moment to the next. As you watched, a small dark shape moved across the water near the far bank, a rowboat with a single occupant, its oars dipping and rising with a rhythm so slow that it seemed to be barely moving. The occupant was a fisherman, you guessed, or a messenger crossing from one quinta to another, and the tiny boat cast a long wavering reflection that was darker than the surrounding water. You followed its progress for a while, watching it shrink to a dot and then disappear round the bend where the river curved away toward the sea, and when it was gone, you let your eyes unfocus, the window glass dissolving into a blur of light and shadow. The iron bars under your fingers had warmed slightly since you first touched them, and you shifted your grip, feeling the rough texture of the flaking paint and the smoother metal beneath. A small spider had spun a web in the corner of the window frame, its silk so fine that it was visible only when the light caught it at a particular angle, and the spider itself, a tiny brown speck, sat motionless at the center, waiting for something that might never come. The web was dotted with dust, and the dried husks of insects too small to identify, and it trembled slightly in a draught that you could not feel, a movement of air that came from somewhere deeper in the lodge. You watched the web for a moment, the way it caught the light and held it, and then you let your attention return to the river and the boats. The boatman's murmur had subsided now, the laughter having run its course, and the shade under the plane tree was quiet, except for the faint, rhythmic sound of a man snoring, a low, guttural vibration that was almost like the purr of a large animal. The others were still, their bodies slack in the heat, and the only movement came from the shifting patterns of sunlight as the leaves above them stirred in a breath of wind that was too high to reach the ground. The stillness was complete, a tableau of rest that seemed to have been arranged for your quiet observation, and you felt a kinship with those sleeping men that required no words and no exchange of glances. They were doing what the heat demanded, just as you were doing what the barrels demanded, and both forms of work were part of the same larger rhythm that governed the valley. You remained at the window for a while longer, the minutes uncounted and unimportant, and you felt the tension of the morning's work slowly dissolve from your neck and your shoulders. The heat, which had seemed oppressive when you were moving between the barrels, now felt merely warm, a comfortable blanket that wrapped around you and asked for nothing. The lodge behind you was silent, the roof tiles having ceased their clicking, and the only sound besides the distant murmur of the river was the steady, slow tick of the leaking drop falling into its bowl in the back chamber. That sound was so regular, so perfectly spaced, that it had become a kind of clock, a measure of time that required no numbers and no hands. Eventually, without making a decision to do so, you turned away from the window and let your eyes adjust again to the dimness of the lodge's interior. The rectangle of light from the doorway had shifted further, now touching the foot of the cooper's bench, and the dust still drifted in its beam with the same slow, patient motion. The cart waited where you had left it, the tapping pipe resting on its plank beside the spirit cask, and the second row of barrels stretched ahead into the shadows, each one ready for its turn. You walked back to the cart, the sound of your footsteps soft on the packed earth, and you picked up the tapping pipe, its surface warm but not hot, and you checked the spirit cask to see that there was enough left for the next few casks. The work would resume, and you would carry with you the image of the river and the boats and the sleeping men under the plane tree, a quiet picture that would stay in the back of your mind as you moved through the rows. The tapping pipe made a small sharp tick as it brushed against the rim of the nearest barrel, a sound that was immediately swallowed by the lodge's silence, and you began again, the same careful sequence, the same steady pour, while the outside world continued its slow hot dream beyond the stone walls. The second row of barrels began, not with a sharp division from the first, but with a subtle shift in the character of the wood, a change that you felt under your fingers before you saw it with your eyes. The casks in this row were older, some of them having rested in their cradles for 6 or 7 years, and their staves had darkened from the pale gold of new oak to a deep, rich brown that was almost the color of strong coffee. The iron hoops, too, showed the passage of time in the fine, powdery rust that covered them like a dusting of cinnamon, and the chalk marks on the heads had faded to faint, ghostly lines that you could only read if you tilted your head to catch the light from the high windows at just the right angle. The air around this row smelled different as well, the sharp, fruity notes of the younger wine giving way to something deeper and more complex, an aroma that had layers you could separate and name if you took the time to breathe it in slowly. It was the smell of the lodge in its maturity, the accumulated scent of years of slow evaporation and careful tending, and it wrapped around you like a familiar, comfortable garment as you wheeled the cart into position before the first barrel of the row. The 8th barrel of the day, which was the second in this older row, drew your attention with a particular insistence. It was not the largest barrel in the lodge, nor the oldest, but it had a presence that you had noticed before, a quiet dignity that came from the quality of its wood and the care with which it had been made. Its staves were exceptionally broad, cut from a single great oak that must have been ancient when it was felled, and the grain of the wood ran in long, unbroken lines from chime to chime, interrupted only by the occasional knot that the cooper had drilled and plugged with such precision that the plugs were almost invisible. The surface of the barrel was smooth to the touch, polished not by any tool, but by the years of handling, the countless times you and the keepers before you had run your hands over its belly while checking its temperature and its ullage. This barrel held a wine from a quinta, whose name you had spoken only rarely, a small vineyard on the upper slopes that produced grapes of an extraordinary depth and darkness, and its contents had been aging long enough that the wine inside was no longer merely port, but something beginning to approach the quiet, complex character that would one day make it remarkable. You placed your palm flat against the swell of the 8th barrel and felt the familiar, slightly cool temperature of the old wood, a temperature that seemed to come not from the air around it, but from deep within the cask itself. The wood was alive in a way that newer oak was not, saturated through every fibre with the wine it had held for so many years, and it gave back a faint, damp resilience when you pressed it, like pressing your thumb into a firm loaf of bread. The iron hoops, rusted to a dark, velvety orange, creaked softly when you shifted your weight against the barrel, and the sound was a low, musical note that faded almost as soon as it was born. You bent forward and put your nose close to the stave, inhaling deeply, and the scent that came to you was so complex that it seemed to bypass your conscious mind and go directly to some older, deeper part of your memory. It was the smell of the forest where the oak had grown, a forest of deep shade and damp earth where the trees stood far apart and their roots reached down into the mineral soil of the hills. It was the smell of the cooper's workshop, the sharp tang of freshly cut wood, and the faint smokiness of the fire over which the staves had been bent into their curved shape. It was the smell of the wine itself, of dark cherries and black plums and something spicier, like cinnamon or clove. And underneath it all there was the clean, faintly medicinal scent of the spirit that you had been adding season after season. These smells were not separate. They had blended over the years into a single unified presence that was the signature of this particular barrel, as distinctive as a face or a voice. The newer barrels, by contrast, still carried the sharp, resinous scent of wood that remembered the forest too well. They were only a year or two old, their staves still pale, and their iron hoops still bright with the dark grey of new metal. And when you leaned close to them, you could smell the piney sharpness of the sap that had not yet fully dried, the clean, almost medicinal aroma of tannin that was still working to bind the wine and soften its edges. The newer barrels were more demanding. They drew more spirit from the wine, absorbed more of its volatile character, and required more frequent topping up. Their ullage was always greater than that of the older casks, and the sound of the spirit falling into them was a brighter, sharper sound, a splash that echoed slightly in the open space above the wine. The old barrels drank slowly, reluctantly, their wood already saturated with the vintages they had held, and the spirit you poured into them today would still be there in some fraction, many years from now, when the barrel was finally opened and the wine decanted into bottles. The new barrels were still learning their trade. The old barrels had mastered it. As you worked your way along the 8th barrel, checking its ullage and preparing the tapping pipe, you noticed the particular smell of this cask more intensely. The plug, when you removed it, was stained a deep, almost black purple, and the scent that rose from the open bunghole was so rich that you paused with the plug in your hand, letting the aroma fill your senses. It was the smell of a wine that had moved past its youth and was settling into its middle age. A quiet, patient maturity that would continue to deepen for another decade or more. The ullage was minimal, barely a thumb's width below the mark, and you knew that this barrel had been topped not long before, perhaps the previous week, and that the angels had been kind to it in the intervening days. You tilted the spirit cask and guided the stream into the darkness, and the sound of the pour was different here. A softer, more muffled splash that spoke of a surface that was closer to the top, and a wine that was dense enough to absorb the new spirit without complaint. The stream fell for only a few seconds before the level kissed the mark, and you stopped, wiping the spout with the rag and fitting a fresh plug into the bunghole with a gentle press of your thumb. The barrel was sealed, and it would continue its long, slow journey toward whatever distant year it was destined for. You moved on to the next barrel, the 9th in the overall count and the 3rd in this older row, and you found the same deep wood and the same rich scent, though the notes were subtly different. This barrel had been made by a different cooper, and his style was evident in the tighter joints and the slightly different shape of the chime, a bevel that was a fraction steeper than the one on the 8th barrel. The cooper's mark, a small stamped impression near the bunghole, was an anchor with a letter inside it, and you had seen this mark on many barrels in the lodge, the work of a man whose family had been making casks for the port trade for 4 generations. His barrels were known for their tight grain and their slow, even evaporation, and the wine they held always aged with a particular elegance, a smoothness that other coopers could not quite match. The mark was worn but still legible, and you touched it briefly with your fingertip before turning your attention to the ullage. The ullage in this barrel was slightly greater, perhaps 1.5 inches, and the wine inside had a different character when you smelled it. A touch more acidity, a brighter fruit note that reminded you of red currants, and a faint, almost imperceptible smokiness that might have come from the charring of the staves during the bending process. Some coopers charred the inside of their barrels lightly, passing a bundle of burning straw through the cask to toast the inner surface, and this process imparted a subtle, smoky flavor that remained in the wood for its entire life. You had never met the cooper who made this barrel, but you knew his work, and you thought of him now as you guided the spirit into the cask, a man in a workshop somewhere upriver, his hands rough and his eyes squinting against the smoke of his fire, shaping wood that would outlast him by many decades. The thought was a fleeting one, gone almost as soon as it arrived, but it left a small trace of warmth, a sense of connection to a larger story that your own work was part of. The repetition of the task had by now woven a pattern that was less a series of actions and more a single continuous flow. You lifted the tapping pipe, tilted the cask, watched the level rise, stopped at the mark, sealed the bunghole, and shifted the cart, and then you did it again. And again, each barrel a small variation on the same quiet theme. The pattern had a rhythm that your body had learned long ago, and your hands moved through it without hesitation, finding the plug, checking the ullage, guiding the stream. There was a comfort in this rhythm, a sense that the world was orderly, and that your place in it was secure, and you let yourself sink into the repetition as a swimmer sinks into a calm sea, feeling the support of the water without struggling against it. The work did not require thought, but it did require attention, and you gave it your full attention, noticing the small differences between the barrels while also noticing the greater sameness that connected them all. The smell of the old oak, the sound of the spirit falling, the feel of the smooth tapping pipe in your hand, the sight of the dusty light slanting through the high windows, the taste of the dry, wine-scented air on your tongue, these sensations blended together into a single quiet experience that filled your awareness and left no room for anything else. You were not thinking about the past or the future, not planning or remembering, but simply present in the row of barrels, your hands moving and your senses open. a part of the lodge as much as the stone walls and the timber roof. The angel's share continued its invisible work. The heat continued its steady press against the outside walls, and the river continued its slow journey to the sea. But inside the lodge there was only the quiet rhythm of the topping up, the soft sounds of wine and wood, and the calm, steady presence of a keeper doing what needed to be done. The 10th barrel approached in the 11th, and the row stretched on into the afternoon, patient and still. The sun had crossed the invisible meridian of the roof and begun its slow descent toward the western hills, though the heat gave no sign of relenting, and the light remained as bright and steady as it had been at noon. What changed was not the intensity of the light, but its angle, the way it entered the lodge through the high windows and fell across the floor in long, slanting columns that stretched further and further into the interior. The morning beams had been sharp and vertical, cutting down through the dusty air like the blades of narrow swords, but the afternoon light came in at a shallower pitch, spreading out as it passed through the rippled glass and forming broad golden pools on the packed earth. These pools had soft edges, the light diffusing gently into the surrounding shadow rather than ending in a hard line, and they moved with a slowness that was almost imperceptible, shifting a fraction of an inch each minute as the sun continued its arc. The quality of the light itself had warmed, the pale gold of morning deepening to a richer amber tone that seemed to carry the weight of the long day within it, a honey-colored glow that made everything it touched look older and more precious. The dust, which had been present all day as a fine suspended haze, now took on a new visibility in the angled beams. Each mote that drifted into the path of the light became a tiny glowing spark, a point of pale fire that floated and turned and sank in the still air, and the collective effect was of a slow, silent dance, a gentle swirl of illuminated particles that never repeated the same pattern twice. You had watched the dust many times before, on many afternoons, and it never failed to draw your eye, this quiet spectacle of light and air that required no audience and asked for nothing. The dust motes rose from the floor when your footsteps disturbed the packed earth. They drifted down from the rafters where years of fine, dry sediment had settled on the beams, and they entered through the windows as the outside air carried in pollen from the hills and the faint, invisible ash from distant fires. Together they formed a soft, golden curtain that hung in the afternoon light, and you could see the trails where your earlier movements had pushed aside the dust, the air in your wake slightly clearer for a moment before the motes drifted back to fill the gap. The floor itself told a story of the day's work, a story written in the fine pale dirt that covered the packed earth. From the doorway to the first row, from the first row to the cart, and from the cart along the central aisle, your footsteps had left a visible path, a series of soft impressions that overlapped and blurred together into a continuous trail. The dirt was not deep, just a thin layer of dust and fine sand that had been carried in on boots and blown through the open doors over the years, but it was enough to record the passage of your feet, the slight drag of your heel, the rounded print of your sole. The trail wound through the first chamber and disappeared into the second, a pale line on the darker earth, and it was joined in places by the narrow tracks of the cart's wheels, two parallel grooves that ran straight along the row and then curved around the end to come back the other way. These marks would be erased the next time you swept the floor, but for now they remained as a quiet record, a map of the day that needed no legend. The barrels in the middle rows, where you were now working, threw long shadows across the floor that angled away from the windows like dark, solid extensions of the casks themselves. The shadows were sharp-edged near their source, tracing the exact curve of the barrel's belly and the precise outline of the cradle, but they softened as they stretched further, their edges blurring and fading until they merged with the general dimness of the lodge. Where the shadows of adjacent barrels overlapped, they created pools of deeper darkness, and where the light fell between them, it formed bright stripes on the earth, a pattern of gold and brown and dark that shifted almost unnoticeably as the sun moved. In and out of this pattern you worked, stepping from shadow into light and back again, the temperature on your skin changing by a fraction of a degree each time, a subtle alternation that you were barely aware of, but which contributed to the slow, rhythmic quality of the afternoon. The row you were on now was the furthest from the door in the first chamber, a line of barrels that stood against the internal wall separating the chamber from the second. This wall was thick, a full 3 feet of stone and mortar, and it absorbed the heat of the day and radiated it back gently into the space, so that the air near these barrels was a degree or two warmer than elsewhere. The barrels themselves were a mix of ages, some young and pale, others older and darkened, and they responded to the warmth in their individual ways. A young barrel near the wall was warm to the touch on its outer face, the oak having absorbed the heat of the stone and passed it inward to the wine, and its ullage was deeper than expected, the angels having been busy in this sheltered corner. An older barrel beside it was cooler, its thicker saturated wood resisting the warmth, and its ullage was barely changed. You top the young barrel with a longer pour, watching the spirit fall in the golden light, and then you top the older one with just a splash. The difference in their needs, a small tangible measure of the heat's uneven effect. As you sealed the older barrel and moved the cart forward, your attention was drawn to the small details that the afternoon light made visible. The bunkholes, which in the dim morning had been simple dark circles, now showed their individual characters under the slanting beams. Some were perfectly round, drilled by a steady hand and a sharp auger, their edges smooth, and their inner walls straight. Others were slightly oval, the result of a drill that had wandered or a bung that had swollen and pressed against the wood over the years. Each hole had its own fit, its own way of receiving the plug, and you noticed the differences without cataloguing them, feeling them through your fingers rather than naming them in your mind. The first bung you removed from the next barrel came out with a soft resistance-free pull, the cloth plug sliding from the hole as easily as a spoon from a bowl. The sound it made was a gentle, breathy sigh, the faint rush of air equalizing between the inside of the barrel and the room. This was a loose fit, a bung that had shrunk slightly in the dry heat and no longer sealed as tightly as it should, and you made a mental note to replace it with a slightly larger plug from the stack on the cart. The loose plugs were not a problem in themselves, but they allowed more air into the barrel than was ideal, and the wine inside would oxidize too quickly if left unattended for too long. You selected a fresh plug, a folded square of linen that was slightly thicker than the one you had removed, and you set it aside for when the topping was complete. The next barrel presented a different challenge. Its bung was tight, a plug of soft wood rather than cloth, and it had been seated firmly with the mallet at the last topping. When you tried to pull it free, it resisted, the oak having absorbed moisture from the wine and swollen to press tightly against the sides of the hole. You worked it loose with a careful rocking motion, using the edge of the tapping pipe as a gentle lever, and it came out with a low, corked thud that echoed softly in the quiet chamber. The sound was a solid, satisfying one, a deep note that spoke of a good seal and a wine that had been protected from the air. The plug itself was stained a rich, dark purple at its tip, and the wood was damp and slightly spongy to the touch, saturated with the spirit it had been holding back. You set it on the cart to dry, and noted that it would need to be replaced with a dry plug after the topping, for a wet plug would not seal properly and might introduce unwanted flavors into the wine. The third barrel in this section had a cloth plug that was wedged so tightly that you had to use both hands to free it, one to grip the folded edge of the cloth and the other to brace against the chime of the barrel. When it finally released, it did so with a sharp, high pop, a sound that cut through the quiet like the snap of a small twig, and it was followed by an audible inrush of air as the partial vacuum inside the barrel equalized. This was a barrel that had been cooling since the morning, the wine inside contracting slightly, as the cellar temperature had dropped before the heat of the day reached it, and the vacuum had pulled the plug inward, sealing it tighter than any mallet could. The pop was a sound you had heard 1,000 times, but it still caught your ear each time, a small punctuation mark in the slow sentence of the afternoon. The wine inside was glossy and dark, its surface trembling slightly from the disturbance, and the scent that rose from the open hole was rich with the smell of dried fruits and old oak, a scent that seemed to belong to the late afternoon when the lodge was at its warmest and the barrels were breathing most deeply. The fourth barrel had a bung that was neither tight nor loose, but simply perfect, fitting its hole with a snugness that required a firm but not forceful pull, and the sound it made was a soft, velvety hum, a low note that seemed to vibrate in the wood for a moment before fading. You paused with the plug in your hand and looked at the bunghole, noting the way the light from the window fell across it, revealing the smooth, chamfered edge where the cooper had beveled the hole to guide the bung into place. This barrel had been well made, its every detail precise, and the wine inside it would age with a steady, predictable grace because of that precision. You topped it with the same care you gave to all the barrels, but you did so with a small sense of appreciation for the craft that had made it, a quiet nod to the cooper whose mark was stamped near the hole. The variations continued as you worked along the row, a bung that came out with a wet, sucking sound, a bung that was so dry it crumbled slightly at the edges, a bung that had been pushed in too far and required the tip of the pipe to pry it back, a bung that sat flush and perfect and came away with a clean, crisp pull. Each sound was a small note in the afternoon's quiet music, a rhythm of thuds and pops and hums that accompany the steady trickle of the spirit and the soft scuff of your boots on the earth. You noticed these differences without breaking your rhythm, your hands moving through the familiar sequence while your ears registered the variations and filed them away. The sounds told you about the barrel's conditions, their temperatures, their ages, and the skill of the men who had made them. And you listened to them, as a sailor listens to the sounds of his ship, reading the health of the vessel in every creak and groan. The cart rolled forward, the wheels bumping over a small stone embedded in the earth floor, and you steadied the spirit cask with a hand on its rim. The afternoon light had advanced further, the golden pools on the floor now touching the edge of the archway that led to the second chamber, and the dust in their beams danced on, slow and patient and endlessly varied. You moved to the next barrel, your fingers finding the plug, and the work continued, a quiet, solitary progress through the rows, the lodge around you holding its peace and its warmth, the barrels waiting in their long shadows for the brief, gentle touch of your hands. The farthest corner of the lodge was not a place you visited often, though it had been there all along, hidden in the perpetual dusk at the end of the third chamber, where the hill pressed its weight against the back wall, and the roof beams sloped down to meet the floor. To reach it you had to leave the main rows behind, pass through the low archway that connected the second chamber to the third, and step into a darkness that was almost complete, a still, thick darkness that seemed to hold its breath and wait. The light from the single high window, the one the size of a baking tray, fell in a pale, narrow shaft that illuminated nothing but a small rectangle of floor near the center of the space, and beyond that shaft the shadows gathered so deeply that your eyes could not fully adjust, could only make out the vague shapes of barrels stacked 3 tiers high along the walls. This was the oldest part of the lodge, the part that had been cut into the hillside first, before the outer chambers were added, and the stones here were different from the others. Larger, rougher, their surfaces still showing the chisel marks of the men who had quarried them. The air in this corner was always cool, even on the hottest day, and it carried a smell that was older and earthier than the rest of the lodge, a smell of damp stone and ancient wood, and something else. Something that was the scent of wine resting so deeply that it had almost forgotten its own fruit. In this farthest corner sat the barrels that held the wine on its fine lees, the barrels that were not to be disturbed. These were the casks where the sediment, the tiny particles of grape skin and yeast and crystal that had settled out of the wine over months and years, lay in a soft, dark layer at the bottom, and the wine above it was clarifying, brightening, shedding its last veil of cloudiness. To move these barrels, to rock them or roll them or even to tap them too firmly with the mallet, would stir the sediment back into the wine and undo weeks of quiet settling. And so you had learned long ago to approach them with a particular kind of care, a care that was almost a form of reverence. The lees barrels stood in a small cluster against the back wall, their cradles slightly sunken into the packed earth, their hoops dark with rust and their staves so thickly coated with the grey patina of age that they looked less like wood and more like something geological, something that had grown here rather than been built. Their bung holes were sealed not with cloth plugs but with tight oak bungs that had been driven in with the mallet and left alone, and there were no chalk marks on their heads, only the faint, almost invisible scratches that served as your private code. You did not open them. You did not touch their bungs or reach for the tapping pipe. Instead, you stood before them in the near darkness and you listened, letting the silence of the corner settle around you like a cool, heavy cloth. The first thing you heard was your own breathing, the soft rise and fall of air in your throat, and beyond that there was nothing, not even the tick of the leaking drop that you could hear in the main chambers. The lees barrels were tight and sound, their wine sealed away in a stillness that was deeper than any other part of the lodge, and you listened for any sound that might break that stillness, Any faint hiss of gas or drip of liquid that would indicate a leak or a fermentation still active when it should have been finished. There was none. The wine inside was silent, resting completely, and the silence was the best report it could give you, a confirmation that all was well and that the sediment was doing its slow, patient work. You placed your hand on the nearest barrel, the one with the widest staves and the heaviest hoops, and you let your palm rest there without pressing, feeling the temperature of the wood. It was cool, distinctly cooler than the air in the outer chambers, and the coolness was even, uniform from the top of the barrel to the bottom, a sign that the wine inside was at a steady temperature, and that no internal heat was being generated by unwanted activity. The wood was dry, despite the humidity of the corner, and it felt solid and dense under your fingers, as if the barrel had become a single, seamless object, rather than a collection of separate staves. You moved your hand to the next barrel, a smaller cask that held a different wine from a different quinta, and you found the same coolness, the same solidity, the same deep silence. The third barrel was slightly warmer on its upper surface, a variation of perhaps a single degree, and you paused there, letting your hand linger while you considered the cause. The warmth was likely from the faint air current that entered through the high window and drifted across the ceiling before sinking, a current so gentle that you could not feel it on your skin, but which carried a tiny amount of heat from the outside. It was nothing to worry about. The wine was still cool enough, and the lees were undisturbed. You lifted your hand and stepped back, letting the barrels return to their patient darkness, and you felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that they were well, that the sediment was settling, that the wine was clarifying without your help. These barrels asked for nothing but time, and you gave them that, turning away and leaving them to their long, slow silence. The final rows of regular barrels waited near the back wall of the second chamber, where the air was cooler than the first chamber, but not as cold as the third, and where the stones of the wall showed a fine, glistening sheen of moisture. The coolness here was of a different quality, a damp coolness that rose from the earth behind the wall and seeped through the mortar, condensing on the surface of the granite in tiny, colorless beads that caught the dim light and made the stones look as though they were sweating. The droplets were so small and so evenly distributed that they formed a continuous film rather than separate drops, and when you touched the wall with the back of your hand, the stone felt cold and slightly slippery, the moisture transferring to your skin in a thin, cooling layer that evaporated almost immediately in the drier air. This phenomenon was familiar to you, a natural consequence of the lodge's position against the hillside, where the ground behind the walls stayed damp all year round, and the temperature difference between the earth and the interior air drew moisture through the porous stone. In winter, the sweat was heavier, sometimes forming actual trickles that ran down to the floor and left dark, wet patches on the earth. But in summer, it was a light perspiration, a gentle exhalation that kept the back wall cool and helped to regulate the temperature of the barrels that stood against it. The barrels in this section were the last ones on your list, a short row of perhaps 8 or 9 casks that stood with their heads facing the wall and their bellies toward the aisle. They were a mix of ages, as most rows were, some dark with time and others still carrying the pale color of newer oak, and their chalk marks were visible in the dim light, the numbers and letters standing out as faint white shapes against the brown wood. The floor here was slightly uneven, sloping down toward the center of the chamber where a shallow drain had been cut centuries ago to carry away any water that seeped through the wall, and the cart's wheels bumped and juddered over the irregular surface as you pulled it into position. The scraping of the wheels, a low rhythmic creak that had been present all day but swallowed by the larger space of the main chambers, now became the loudest sound in the room. A dry, wooden groan that repeated with each rotation of the axle and seemed to echo slightly off the damp stones. The cart was old, its wheels worn and its axle dry, and despite the tallow you had rubbed into the bearings the previous winter, it still complained with every turn. A familiar, almost companionable sound that you had long since stopped noticing except in the quietest moments. You positioned the cart before the first barrel of the final row and checked the spirit cask, noting that there was just enough left to complete the work, perhaps 2 or 3 inches of liquid remaining in the bottom. The tapping pipe was still clean, its spout wiped and its channel free of obstruction, and the linen plugs were stacked neatly on the cart. The pile diminished now to a handful of clean squares and several more that had been used and set aside for washing. Everything was ready for the last sequence of the day, the final repetitions of the task that had filled your hours since the early morning. Your movements, which had been calm and deliberate all day, now took on an even softer quality. A sense of completion that was not hurried, but which carried a faint, quiet momentum. The way a river approaching the sea begins to slow and spread. You reached for the first plug and pulled it free, the cloth coming away with a gentle, unresisting slide, and the scent of the wine rose to meet you, familiar and warm. The topping of these last barrels was no different from the topping of the first. The same tilt of the cask and the same thin ruby stream falling into the darkness, but it felt different nonetheless. Each pour seemed to carry a small weight of finality, a sense that this was the last time you would perform this particular action on this particular day, and you found yourself moving with a slightly deeper attention, noticing the way the light from the high window fell across the barrel's head, the way the spirit swirled and mixed with the older wine as it entered, the way the fill mark seemed to welcome the rising liquid as if it had been waiting all day for this moment. The sounds of the final row were softer than those of the first, the splash of the spirit muted by the proximity of the damp wall and the closeness of the ceiling, and the creak of the cart's wheels as you edged it forward between barrels was the only rhythmic noise, a slow, steady groan that marked the progress of the work, like a metronome set to the pace of a resting heart. The air against your skin was cooler here, the sweat on your back beginning to dry and leave a faint, pleasant chill, and the stones beside you breathed their cool moisture into the air, a gentle exhalation that you could feel on your cheek when you turned your head. The dampness was not unpleasant, it was refreshing after the dry heat of the main chambers, and it reminded you of the cellars of your childhood, the cool, dark places under the old houses where wine and oil and cheese were stored against the summer. The memory was a faint one, barely a thought, more a sensation that passed through you and then was gone, leaving only the present moment, the barrel before you, the tapping pipe in your hand, the sound of the spirit falling. The second-to-last barrel was an old one, its staves darkened almost to black, and its ullage was minimal, barely a splash needed to bring it to the mark. You topped it with a quick, neat pour, and sealed it with a fresh plug, and then you moved the cart to the final barrel, the one that stood in the corner where the back wall met the side wall, a quiet, unassuming cask that had been here longer than any of the others in the row. Its wood was dry and slightly rough under your fingers, the grain raised in fine ridges where years of evaporation had left their mark, and the iron hoops were so rusted that the metal had begun to flake, leaving orange powder on your palms. The chalk mark on its head was barely legible, a single letter and a number that you could only read because you already knew what they said. This barrel had been filled the year you first came to the lodge, and it had been topped up by your hand more times than you could count, a quiet companion through many summers and winters. You pulled the plug with a gentle, familiar motion, and the scent that rose from the bunghole was so deep and so complex that it seemed to contain the whole history of the wine, from the grapes on the hillside to the long years of rest in the darkness. You tilted the cask one last time, and the thin stream of spirit fell into the barrel, the surface rising to meet the mark with a soft, final kiss. The final bung pressed into place with a soft, certain pressure, the new oak plug seating itself in the bunghole, with a snugness that needed no mallet, only the firm push of your thumb and the heel of your hand. You held it there for a moment, feeling the wood adjust and settle, the tiny fibers of the plug meshing with the tiny fibers of the stave, and then you withdrew your hand and let the barrel return to its long stillness. The last cask of the day was sealed, its fill line resting exactly at the mark, its wine safe and complete beneath the layer of fresh spirit you had added. A small final drop of the ruby liquid clung to the rim of the bunghole, catching the last of the afternoon light that angled through the high window, and you wiped it away with the corner of the linen rag, folding the cloth afterward and laying it on the cart beside the others. The work was done, and the knowledge of that settled into your mind, not as a thought, but as a quiet bodily release, a loosening of the steady attention that had held you through all the hours since morning. You straightened and let your arms hang at your sides, the tapping pipe still in your right hand, its surface warm and smooth from a day of use. The cart stood beside you, its plank now holding the nearly empty spirit cask, the pile of used cloth plugs, the copper funnel, the wooden bucket of rinse water that had turned a cloudy pink, and the small mallet that you had not needed today. Everything was in order. Everything had served its purpose, and now everything needed to be put back in its place for the night. The routine of finishing the day was as familiar as the routine of starting it. A sequence of small, calm actions that closed the circle and returned the lodge to its sleeping state. You moved through these actions now without hurry, your pace slow and deliberate, your body tired in a pleasant, diffuse way that made each movement feel slightly weighted, as if you were walking through water that was only a little denser than air. The tapping pipe was the first to be tended. You carried it to the corner near the cooper's bench, where a shallow stone basin had been cut into the floor and fitted with a drain that led out through the wall to the riverbank. The basin was filled with clean water from the clay jar, and you immersed the pipe, letting it soak while you used a slender brush with stiff bristles to clean the narrow channel inside. The brush passed through with a soft, scratching sound, pushing out the traces of spirit and wine that had clung to the wood, and the water in the basin swirled with faint ribbons of color before clearing. You rinsed the pipe one final time, shaking the water from the spout, and then you laid it on a clean cloth on the cooper's bench, where it would dry overnight and be ready for the next day. The pipe gleamed in the dim light, its grain highlighted by the moisture, and you left it there with the same care you would give to any trusted tool. The spirit cask, now almost empty, was the next to be dealt with. You lifted it from the cart, tilting it carefully so that the last cupful of spirit would not slosh onto the floor, and you carried it to the small storeroom just off the first chamber, where the larger butts of wine spirits stood in a row against the wall. These butts were massive, taller than a man and wide enough to hold 100 gallons or more, their staves bound with broad iron hoops and their bungholes sealed with heavy wooden plugs wrapped in cloth. The air in the storeroom was thick with the sharp, clean smell of the spirit, and you moved quickly without rushing, setting the small cask down beside its larger cousins and covering its open bunghole with a square of muslin to keep out the dust. The cask would be refilled in the morning, and that would be the first task of the new day, a simple, predictable beginning to another cycle of work. The used cloth plugs, a small pile of stained and damp fabric, went into a basket near the door that you would carry down to the river later for washing. The rinse water in the bucket you emptied out through the doorway, flinging it in a single, smooth arc that scattered the cloudy liquid onto the flagstones, where it spread in a dark fan and began to dry almost immediately in the last warmth of the sun. The bucket was rinsed with a splash of clean water from the jar and set upside down on the cart to dry. The funnel and the mallet and the roll of fresh linen were returned to their places on the shelf above the cooper's bench, each item fitting into the space that had been made for it, a small geometry of order that you restored without thinking. The cart itself, its wheels still creaking faintly, you pushed to its accustomed spot near the inner wall, where a shallow groove in the earth marked where it had stood for months and years. You wedged the wheels with the two small stones to hold it steady, and you gave the plank a final wipe with a damp cloth to remove the stickiness of spilled spirit. The cart was ready for the morning, and it sat in the shadows like a patient animal, waiting. Now the lodge was tidy, the tools stored, the barrel sealed, and the day's work complete. You stood in the center of the first chamber and let your gaze travel one last time along the rows of casks, their curved shapes receding into the darkness of the second and third chambers. The light from the doorway had dimmed considerably, the golden beams of afternoon fading to a soft, dusty grey that barely reached the middle of the floor. The high windows showed a sky that had paled from blue to something lighter, something that carried the first hint of the evening's change. The lodge was quiet, the only sound the distant, rhythmic tick of the leaking drop still falling into its bowl, the sound so regular and so soft that it has become part of the silence itself. You listened to it for a moment, a sound that would continue through the night and into the next day, a tiny, patient heartbeat in the darkness. Then you turned toward the doorway and walked slowly toward the threshold, your footsteps the last mark you would leave on the packed earth until the morning. The outside air met you with a gentleness that the morning had not possessed. The fierce, pressing heat of noon had mellowed into a warm, even blanket that rose from the stones, the quay, the river, and the hills, a warmth that seemed to come from all directions at once and carried with it the accumulated breath of the long day. The flagstones under your boots were still warm, the granite having absorbed the sun's energy and now releasing it slowly back into the evening, and you could feel the stored heat radiating upward through the worn leather of your soles, a pleasant, grounding sensation that connected you to the solid earth. The air itself had a different quality, a softness that had been absent in the dry, bright hours of the afternoon, and it moved against your face with a faint, almost imperceptible current, the first stirring of the breeze that would come down from the hills after sunset. You stepped fully outside and turned to face the river, your hands resting on your hips as you drew a long, slow breath. The Douro had transformed yet again, shedding its noon brilliance for a deeper, quieter aspect that caught the changing sky and held it. The surface was still, a sheet of polished pewter that reflected the pale blue above, and the first faint hints of rose and gold that were gathering near the western ridge. The reflection was not sharp, not the hard mirror of midday, but a soft, blurred image that trembled slightly as the slow current moved beneath it, and the river seemed to be darkening from within, its color shifting from bronze to a deep, cool gray that would soon deepen into the charcoal of dusk. The far hills, which had been sharp and bleached under the noon sun, were now softening again, their edges blurring as the haze of evening began to rise from the cooling earth, and the terraced vineyards that climbed their slopes were a patchwork of dark greens and deep browns, the individual vines lost in the gathering shadow. The sky above the hills was the focus of the change, a slow, silent spectacle that you had watched 1,000 times and which never grew old. The pale, whitish blue of the late afternoon was retreating toward the east, overtaken by a band of color that began as a faint yellow at the horizon and deepened through shades of gold and amber to a dusty, muted rose that spread across the highest clouds. These colors were not bright, not the vivid oranges and pinks of a winter sunset, but soft and subdued, a gentle watercolor wash that seemed to have been breathed onto the sky rather than painted. The clouds themselves were thin, stretched strands of vapor that caught the light and held it, their undersides glowing with a pale peach-colored luminescence, while their upper edges faded into the deepening blue. The sun was now hidden behind the highest ridge, its disk no longer visible, but its presence still felt in the warm glow that suffused everything, a light that seemed to come from the earth as much as from the sky. The Rebelo boats, still moored along the quay, had lost their sharp shadows, and now floated in a soft, directionless light that made them look insubstantial, like boats in a painting rather than solid vessels of wood and iron. Their empty barrels, which had been baking in the sun hours before, were now cool and dry, their pale wood catching the last of the daylight and holding it with a faint, silvery gleam. The boatmen who had slept under the plane tree were stirring now, their voices rising as a low murmur that carried across the water, and you could see the shapes of men standing and stretching, their arms reaching upward, their hats pushed back from their faces. A thin wisp of smoke rose from somewhere near the tree, the first fire of the evening being lit, and the smell of burning pine drifted across the quay, a clean, sharp scent that mixed with the warm, earthy smell of the river and the cooling stone. The plane tree itself, which had provided shade all day, now stood with its leaves catching the rosy light, their undersides flickering with a pale, golden reflection as the breeze stirred them. The tree was ancient, its trunk scarred and thick, its branches spreading wide over the packed earth where the boatmen were now gathering their belongings and preparing for the evening. Some of them would sleep on their boats, you knew, while others would walk back to the small village that clustered further along the bank, and the quiet sounds of their departure were a part of the evening's rhythm, a gentle stirring that matched the slow fading of the light. You did not call out to them, and they did not call out to you, but there was an awareness between you, a shared recognition of the day's end, the completion of the work that the weather had dictated. You turned your attention back to the lodge, its long, low silhouette dark against the glowing sky, and you walked the few steps to the heavy double doors. They stood open still, the way you had left them, and the interior beyond was now a well of deep shadow, the rows of barrels invisible in the darkness, the small sounds of the building reduced to an absolute quiet. You reached for the right-hand door first, its iron handle cool and solid under your palm, and you swung it inward with a slow, steady pull. The hinges, kept well oiled with tallow from the kitchen, made no sound as the door moved, only a soft, deep breath of displaced air that brushed past your face with a scent of oak and wine. The left-hand door followed, its weight the same, its motion the same, and you brought the two leaves together gently, their meeting marked by a muffled wooden thump that resonated through the frame and then faded into the stone. The lodge was closed, its contents sealed away for the night, and the barrels inside were now resting in a darkness as complete as the darkness of the hillside that pressed against the back wall. The lock that held the doors was an old mechanism, a heavy iron bolt that slid through a hasp and was secured with a key that you carried on a cord around your neck. The key was large, its shaft thick and its ward worn smooth by many years of turning, and you drew it out from under your shirt now, feeling the warmth of your own body still clinging to the metal. The bolt slid into place with a familiar, solid clunk, a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet evening, and the key turned in the lock with a soft, well-oiled click, a final, definitive note that marked the true end of the day. You tested the doors once with a gentle push, and they held firm, the lock engaged, the barrels safe. The lodge would rest now, undisturbed, through the night and into the cool of the morning when you would return to begin again. You stood before the closed doors for a while, letting the evening gather around you, the key still in your hand and the cord still loose around your neck. The river flowed past the quay with a low, continuous murmur that was more a presence than a sound, a gentle, liquid hush that had been there all day and would be there all night, unchanged by the passing of the hours. The water was darker now, its pewter surface deepening to a soft, opaque black that reflected the last band of amber light along the horizon and the first faint star that had appeared above the eastern hills. The star was small and pale, barely visible, a single point of cool light that seemed to have been waiting behind the blue of the day, and you looked at it for a moment before looking back at the river. The current moved past the boats, past the quay, past the lodge, carrying with it the same small leaves and twigs, and the same faint scent of the distant hills, a scent of dry grass and warm earth, and the memory of the sun. The far bank was now a silhouette, the hills a series of dark, folded shapes against the lighter sky, and the terraced vineyards were invisible, hidden in the deep shadow that pooled in the valley. Somewhere on those slopes, the grapes were cooling after the long heat, their skins beaded with the first moisture of the night, and the vines were resting, their leaves hanging still in the calm air. The quayside at your feet, which had shimmered with heat only a few hours before, was now a stretch of cool grey stone, its cracks and fissures softened by the twilight, and the small weeds that grew in those cracks had closed their leaves for the evening, tiny bundles of green that would not open again until the sun returned. Everything was settling, drawing inward, preparing for the long, quiet hours of darkness that lay ahead, and you felt your own body responding to the same rhythm, your breathing deepening and your thoughts slowing, your mind as quiet and as still as the river. The boatmen were gone now. Their figures disappeared into the dusk, and the smoke from their fire had faded to a faint, lingering haze that hung low over the water. The plane tree stood alone in the deepening twilight, its leaves a soft, rustling murmur that blended with the sound of the river. You tucked the key back under your shirt, felt its familiar weight settle against your chest, and then you turned your back on the lodge and began to walk slowly along the quay, your footsteps quiet on the worn flagstones. The path led along the river bank, past the silent boats and the empty barrels, past the small huts where the boatmen stored their gear, and then up a gentle slope toward the cluster of houses that marked the edge of the village. The air was cooler now, the warmth of the stones giving way to a fresher, cleaner coolness that came from the hills and the open valley, and it felt good on your skin, a gentle, soothing touch that promised a night of deep, unbroken sleep. You did not look back at the lodge, though you could feel its presence behind you, a solid, reliable weight in the darkness. The barrels inside were sealed and sleeping, their wine resting exactly where it should be, the angel's share rising slowly through the oak, as it always did, the leaking drop still falling into its bowl with its patient, steady tick. Nothing would disturb them, no sudden noise, no change of temperature, no human hand, until the morning when you would return and begin the same quiet cycle all over again. The work was never finished, not truly, but it was paused, held in a perfect temporary stillness that was as old and as constant as the river itself. The last light faded from the sky as you walked, the dusty rose giving way to a deep, soft violet that spread across the horizon and merged with the darkness that was climbing from the east. More stars appeared, tiny points of cold, distant fire that reflected faintly in the river, their images trembling on the slow current. The air smelled of dried grass and warm stone, and the faint, clean scent of the water, and the only sound was the river's low murmur and the soft, even rhythm of your own footsteps on the path. You walked on, toward the lights of the village that glowed warm and yellow in the distance, and behind you the lodge stood dark and silent against the hillside, its barrels resting in rows, its wine aging slowly, steadily, quietly, through the long, calm night.